Buenas tardes.
Good evening, and welcome to our 8th session of the Faith and Science Fundamentals webinar series. Today, we've made it halfway through the series and to the end of the second module, Theories of Origins. Starting next week, we will begin with the modules dedicated to biology, geology, and paleontology. The second half will be more scientific, but I don't want anyone to be scared off by that. I hope that by now that you all can see it very clearly that science is something wonderful and fascinating. And also, we will do our best to explain the most technical content in a more approachable way so that we can all understand it. Biblical creationism. In the last 3 sessions, I shared different theories of origins with you. We started with the theory of evolution, and then explained several of the intermediate theories. And last week, we talked about intelligent design. And today, we're going to finish the theories of origins module with the option that I personally identify with, and that I have called biblical creationism. I know that many of you share the same perspective, and perhaps you are wondering why dedicate an entire session to something so simple. Regarding the origins, creationists believe what the Bible says in Genesis 1-3. That's it. Well, that may be so, but I thought it would be convenient to specify the position of biblical creationism and clarify some things. Today's talk will be divided into 3 parts. In the first part, I will share what we believe. And in the second part, I will share with you what we do not believe. And in the third part, we will talk about what we don't know. Almost everything that I'm going to tell you in the first part, I've taken from a chapter of this book, Understanding Creation, Answers to Questions on Faith and Science. It's from Chapter 2, written by Jim Gibson, who was the director of the GRI for many years and who has just recently retired. By the way, this is one of those books that I recommend that is relevant to the subject of this series. It has 20 chapters written by different Adventist scientists that cover many of the topics that we have already talked about and that we will see in the next few days, like data interpretation, our science in the Bible in conflict, how can we interpret the first chapters of Genesis, the origin of life, the flood, the dinosaurs, and what's more, each topic has been summarized and written at a very approachable level with no technical terms so that anyone can understand it. It's available in English and Spanish, and I'm not sure if there are any other languages. I will leave the links in the additional materials document. The title of the chapter that I was just talking about is What is Creation Theory? What Gibson calls the theory of creation is what I have called biblical creationism. It's also known as recent 6-day creation. Why don't we just call it creation? Well, because as we saw when we talked about intermediate theories, there are other options that also use or they are called creation or creationism that are not what we're talking about here today. I mean things like the gap theory, which proposes that there are 2 creations separated by a long period of time, or the days, ages, according to which each day of creation lasted millions of years. And the creation theory is also not exactly the same as young Earth creationism, but as we will see later, it does not require a young Earth or that the universe be created 6,000 years ago. The first thing that Gibson emphasizes at the beginning of the chapter is that the creation of theory assumes the activity of a supernatural agent, using procedures that are beyond our experience. For this reason, the events that occurred in that creation cannot be discovered empirically, but be revealed supernaturally. What does this mean? Well, as we saw last week, there is much evidence in nature that suggests design. But if we didn't have the revelation, or the Bible, there would be no way of knowing what God created in 7 days, and that on the first day He created the light, on the fifth day the birds and the fish. We know this because the Bible says so. Those of us who adhere to this perspective of origins believe that the Bible is the Word of God. We believe that it tells the truth, and we believe that what is said in Genesis 1 through 3 happened just as it appears in the text. Last week, we said that intelligent design tries to keep the discussion about origins exclusively scientific. That is not the case with biblical creationism. This is a religious position, and many of the key points of this theory do not arise from science, but from the Bible. So what are those key points? Well, first, God is external and prior to the physical universe. The Bible begins with the phrase, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," which indicates that God was there before anything else. There are other verses in the Bible that emphasize the same idea, such as John 1 through 3. This time, speaking of Jesus, it says, "In the beginning was the Verb," and later adds, "All things were made by Him." So the first key idea is that God is eternal, and that puts Him in a different category from everything else, the physical, the temporal, all which have been created by Him. The second, God creates with His Word. Throughout Genesis 1, we read that God creates through verbal commands that are automatically fulfilled. "Let there be light," and there was light. "Let there be an expanse between the waters. Let there be land. Let there be waters." This shows that God does not depend on pre-existing matter to create. But that does not mean that He cannot create using pre-existing matter. In fact, when He creates Adam, He does it differently, not with a verbal command, but by forming him from the dust of the ground. And to create Eve, He uses a rib from Adam. Number 3, 6 days of creation plus 1 day of rest. We've already commented on this several times, but that it is one of the foundations of the biblical creation, we will insist once more. The days of Genesis 1 are literal days, with their evenings and mornings. We know this because the original terminology of the text makes it clear, but also because God Himself affirms it in Exodus 20 and 31. God asks His people to keep the Sabbath a literal day because in 6 literal days, He created the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh, a literal day, He rested. The fourth, diversity from the start. The text in Genesis makes it very clear that God created different types of living beings independently of each other, and that He created different kinds of each. On the third day, He mentions the grass and the trees, and on the fifth day, there is the talk of living beings, according to their kind of the great sea monsters and all the winged birds. And the sixth day, He distinguishes cattle, wild animals, and crawling beasts. There is no doubt that both the animal and the plant worlds were diverse from the beginning, and that there is no common ancestor for all living things. The fifth, special creation of a human being. God created human beings on the same day as land animals, but the text makes it clear that there is something different about these creatures. We've already commented that God takes the trouble to mold Adam, and by blowing his breath into him, he gives him life. But what is really important is that human beings are the only creature made in the image of God. The text specifies that both male and female were created in his image. Another characteristic that differentiates them from the animals is that Adam and Eve were created individually and then united in marriage, which also makes them like God, because it reminds us of the individuality and the union of the Trinity. The sixth, a good original creation that became corrupted. The creation account insists 6 times that what God made was good, and for a 7th time, when everything is finished, it is reaffirmed that it was very good. This characteristic of biblical creationism distinguishes it from all intermediate theories in which God's original plan included such things as suffering and death from the beginning. According to the biblical account, the type of the world that God created contained none of that. Degradation, suffering, pain, and death are intruders that corrupted the earth after Adam and Eve decided to disobey. This view is consistent with the rest of the Bible, in which death is described as a consequence of sin and an enemy to be overcome. Creation groaning because of sin, and a new earth without suffering or death. And finally, number 7, a recent creation. How recent? The writers of the Bible do not specify the date of creation. Estimates have been calculated using biblical chronologies, but depending on the source, different results are obtained. The best known, the famous 6,000 years, are based on the Masoretic text of the scriptures. But if the Septuagint is used, the figure increases to 7,500. Since the Bible doesn't give any importance to the exact date, and we know that biblical chronologies sometimes skipped a generation, most creationists prefer to speak of less than 10,000 years. What is clear is that we move in a range of a few thousand years. 6,000, 7,000, 8,000. The biblical text does not allow to extend that a period indefinitely, and of course, there is no way that it means millions or billions of years. Well, and that's what we believe. The first part. Not because we have scientifically proven it, but because the Bible says so. And now for this part, the second part, what we do not believe. This part shouldn't be necessary, but unfortunately, there are people who have no idea what biblical creationism is, and many times, information on the internet does not help at all. For example, you already know that intelligent design and creationism are 2 different things. But if you search Wikipedia for intelligent design, the article begins by saying, "This article is about a form of creationism." The following example is more serious. If you look for fixism, also on Wikipedia, you'll find a long article, and in one of the sections titled Fixism Today, it reads the following. Currently in the United States, the followers of fixism try to have it taught in schools on equal terms with the theory of evolution. Well, this is completely false. And that is why this section is necessary, in which we are going to specify some things that are not part of the biblical creationism. In the first place, biblical creationists are not fixists. Fixism is an idea of Greek origin that maintains that nature is immutable since creation. In the past, the church embraced this belief and affirmed that since God's creation was perfect, it could not change. And therefore, the species that were in the world had been created by God in the same way and in the same places where they were found. Some famous creationists of theory, such as Linnaeus and Cuvier, were fixists. But already from the time of Darwin, it was a minority belief. When Darwin proposed his idea of the change in species by natural selection, most of the scientific and religious community had already accepted that animals and plants could change because, like Darwin, everyone was aware that agricultural and livestock artificial selection had produced considerable changes in some species. And today, all creationists believe that species of animals and plants can and do change by different mechanisms. In fact, God himself affirms in the Bible that animals and plants would change as a result of sin. The snake would slither, which implies that it did not before, and that plants would produce thorns, which means that they did not before. So the question that creationists ask themselves is not whether living things can change, which of course they can, but what kinds of changes are possible and how much can they change. We'll talk about this in a moment, but we still have one more part of this section. Biblical creationists do not believe that the earth is flat. This is an issue that hurts me to have to talk about, so I'm going to get through it as quickly as I can because we have more things to talk about or discuss. But I think that we have to mention it because it hurts me even more knowing that on the internet and in some articles, creationists are put in the same bag as flat earthers. Because flat earthers claim that they base their beliefs on a literal interpretation of the Bible, and so do we. And so for many people, the two positions are the same, just as unscientific and just as absurd. But it turns out that they are not the same. They are not really alike at all, because the Bible does not say anywhere that the earth is flat. All the texts that are used to defend this idea are used out of context, like this one that you can see here on the screen. And also, although you may have heard the opposite, except for some eccentric people who are always everywhere, the church has always believed in a spherical earth. The foolishness of the flat earth arose in the 19th century as an attempt to discredit people who take the Bible seriously. So if you know someone who believes that the earth is flat and says that their belief is based on the Bible, please tell them to do their research, to read the experts who research the Bible, and not the conspiranoids on the internet. And tell them that they're not doing the church any favors. On the contrary, these types of irrational attitudes cause believers in the Bible to be put in the same bag as them, and then we're not taken seriously. I'll leave this subject now and move on to the third part, which may be the most interesting of today's topic, the things that we do not know. Although the Genesis account is very clear on some things, there are other things that are not so clear and that raise questions. We're going to comment on some of those questions, but I just want to let you know in advance that I don't have definitive answers. When was the universe created? There are different ways to interpret the first verses of the Bible. Some consider that the story includes the creation of the entire universe and that verses 1 through 3 go one right after another, with no time in between. So God would have created the universe, including the earth, about 6,000 years ago, and then he would have started to organize it and fill it with life. This is the position of young earth creationism. According to another interpretation, the first verse, which would refer to the creation of the universe, could be before the creation week and be separated from it by a very long period of time, even millions of years. As the Bible does not give us details of the process of creation of the universe, people who adhere to this interpretation often accept the possibility of the Big Bang as the mechanism that God used for that creation. And much later, a few thousand years ago, the earth was in a state of chaos and desolation when God began his task of organizing it and creating life in a literal week, as described in the rest of Genesis 1. In addition to these main options, there are other interpretation possibilities. For example, there are those who consider that the universe was created millions of years ago, but that the biblical text does not refer to that, but to the astronomical environment, the skies of the earth, which would be the solar system. These people believe that the entire solar system was created about 6,000 years ago, but the stars could be older, the rest of the universe could be older. Within the Adventist Church, there are supporters of all three interpretations, but among theologians and among scientists. One of the arguments used by the supporters of the first option, and that to me seems to have a lot more weight, is the following. The time between the creation of the universe and the creation of life on earth coincides with our vision of the great conflict, the cosmic conflict. In that period, the rebellion of Satan and the creation of other worlds could have occurred. Another argument that is often used in favor of an ancient universe is that if the universe were only 6,000 years old, we would not be able to see many of the stars that we see today because they are more than 6,000 light years from Earth, and their first rays wouldn't have reached us yet. There's some that are closer, but others that are farther away. But in my view, this argument is much poorer than the previous one. If God has the power to create the stars, he also has the power to create the ray and bring it instantly to Earth. Adventist scientists who prefer the first option often argue that there is a lot of astronomical evidence for the Big Bang and for an ancient universe. We don't have time to go into detail, and it's also a complex subject, but in the list of additional materials, I will leave some articles on this subject by the Adventist astronomer Marthe de Groot. Supporters of a young universe respond to this with the appearance of age counter-argument. During the week of creation, God created many things that, due to their physical appearance, appeared to be much older than they actually were. Adam and Eve and the animals were created adults, and the trees were also created in an advanced stage of development. If we had arrived in the Garden of Eden on the first Sabbath and seen Adam and Eve, without further information, we would have never guessed that they were only 1 day old. Something similar could have happened with the planet, Earth, and the universe. And for some reason, they appear older than they actually are. A related question that we also don't have an answer for is, where does the light of the first day come from? At present, the light that separates day from night comes from the sun. But in the Genesis account, light, day, and night appear on the first day, while the sun does not appear until the fourth day. And by the way, it's not even named as such. It's simply called the greater light. Once again, creationist theologians and scientists have asked themselves this question and have come up with different interpretations. I will leave the reference of a short article by Richard Davidson in the additional materials that we have, and explains the main interpretations very simply and clearly. Where did the light of the first day of creation come from? Here, I'm only going to comment on two options that are the best known and the ones that best fit the biblical text. The first, the light of the first day comes from God. The idea that God emanates light appears repeatedly in the Bible. So it's not unreasonable to think that God could use his own light to illuminate the planet and separate the day from night during the first part of creation week. Then, from the fourth day on, that function, he passes it to the sun and the moon. And according to this interpretation, God would like to make it clear that the sun and the moon are not gods, a belief that was very common among ancient peoples. But they're simply objects, lamps, that serve them. The other possibility is that the sun and the moon were already created before the week of creation, but were invisible from the earth because there was a dense atmosphere that allowed light to pass through, but did not allow shapes to be distinguished. In the original biblical text, the command that God on the fourth day, the one that he used to create, is a little different from the rest of the days and could be interpreted as not describing the creation of the sun, moon, and stars, but more like the assignment of their functions to mark the days, the years, and the seasons. This interpretation is consistent with that of the old universe. The stars would already be present before the week of creation, and the sun would be the main source of light on earth as it is today, and what God did on the fourth day was make it visible. Now let's move on to a series of questions related to things that we have seen in some of the previous sessions. What types of organisms did God create? What does the biblical expression according to their kind mean? And how much could the organisms that were created change? In the previous section, we already explained that the Bible specifies that God created different types of organisms in each category: plants, aquatic animals, flying animals, and land animals. We have also said that there is nothing in the biblical text against change, but quite the opposite. In Genesis 3, the Bible states that animals and plants would change because of sin. So, what does the Bible mean when it speaks of plants and animals according to their kind? In Genesis 1, 11, 25, and 21 and 25. The first thing we have to pay attention to is that the word he uses is different depending on the version of the Bible we are using and the language that we are reading it in. In Spanish, there are times that it says gender and other times that it says species. And in English, it says kind. And I suppose that in other languages, there are also variations. This already tells us that we shouldn't give the word a very strict or specific meaning. And above all, we shouldn't give these words the current meaning that they have in the scientific context. For current science, a species is a group of organisms capable of reproducing together in nature. There are animals that are very similar to each other that are considered different species because they don't normally reproduce with each other. For example, these two types of Spanish raptors are considered different species. Does that mean that God created them separately? Well, I'm pretty sure that the answer is no. I believe that they are the same type of animal that has changed a bit, adapting to the different environmental conditions. In this case, it is quite clear that these two birds are almost identical, but how much can organisms change? Where is the limit? This is a specific field of research called baraminology that some creationist biologists are dedicated to study. The objective of this study is to try to find out what types of organisms were that God created and to establish them in groups of organisms that would have common ancestor. For example, an animal that were a pair of animals on the ark with Noah. They use different techniques to establish these groups, but one of them is to study reproductive compatibility. It is considered that if two animals are capable of having offspring, it is because they are sufficiently similar to each other and that in the past they had a common ancestor. So, for example, we assume that most canids, dogs, wolves, jackals, and even foxes, could be part of a created type or kind because they can breed and produce hybrids. In this photograph here, you can see a coy dog. It's a hybrid of a dog and a coyote. The same happens with the family of horses. That would include donkeys and zebras, because hybrids, like the one that you see on the screen here, can be formed. Likewise, ducks, geese, and swans can produce between different species, so that would make them another created type or kind. And in the case of big cats, it turns out that tigers and lions have hybrid offspring, so they would also have a common ancestor. We wouldn't have just tigers and lions. We would have something that would be mixed, a hybrid. We don't know exactly where the limit of change is, but most creation scientists place it at the level of family. The scientific classification has different categories. The smallest is the species, and the next, the genus. Two animals of the same genus are very similar to each other, so there's no doubt that they have a common ancestor. For example, the dog and the wolf are both from the genus Canis. And the two birds that I showed you before are of the falco genus. The next category is the family, which includes several similar genus or kinds. In the case of the canids, in addition to dogs and wolves, we also would have jackals, dingoes, and foxes. This would be the highest level of change that creationists would accept that would separate microevolution from macroevolution. And here's a related question that we also don't have an answer for. How did the changes come about? We've said that God's creation was good, but today we see many things in nature that aren't good. We find predatory animals and parasites that cause considerable suffering to other animals, poisonous plants and animals, diseases caused by viruses, bacteria, and fungi. And where did it all come from? The short answer is that we don't know. There are probably several processes involved. Mutations and natural selection exist in nature and may have caused some of the changes. Other changes could have been pre-programmed by God in the original design of organisms to allow them to adapt to a world of sin. If God planned the plan of salvation before the creation of the world, it makes sense that He would also plan a series of strategies that would allow plants, animals, and people to survive until the plan of salvation could be completed. It's also possible that after sin, God actively intervened by changing some of the characteristics of the living beings. The curses of Genesis 3 can be interpreted in two ways. One, for example, would be God predicts that what will happen naturally as a result of sin. For example, the serpent would lose its wings as a result of mutation. Or two, God acts directly by removing the wings of the serpent and forcing it to crawl or slither. And finally, there is also the possibility that Satan acted directly, causing some of the changes. We know that Satan is the prince of the world, and we know that from the book of Job that he can manipulate nature and the human body when God allows it. This is a very complicated issue that we don't have a clear answer for. And as you have seen, we don't have unique and consensual answers for the previous questions either. This can be unsettling for some people, but I think it's a good thing. First of all, it makes us humble because it shows us that we don't know everything. And second, It helps us to understand that there can be different answers to the same question, that different people may see things differently, and that we can learn from each other and continue to respect each other and work together even if we disagree on everything. Some of my colleagues at the GRI support the young Earth theory, while others support the old Earth theory. My admired Professor Leonard Brand has some ideas about animals that I disagree with, and that's okay. And ultimately, all of this reminds us of how little we really know and how much we depend on God for true wisdom and true knowledge. Starting next week, we will enter in the second part of the webinar series that focuses on scientific knowledge related to origins. I'm going to tell you what we think we know, but it's possible that over time we will discover that we were wrong in many things. That is one of the most beautiful characteristics of science, that it is always in progress, self-correcting, and learning from mistakes. That is why it is so successful, but also, for that very reason, it is not a sure foundation to build our philosophy of life from. I will finish the same way that I started. Biblical creationism is not a scientific position. Although scientific evidence supports the idea of a wonderful design behind the universe, the earth and living things, I don't believe in a recent six-day creation because of scientific reasons, but because the Bible says so. For me, the Bible is a sure foundation because I personally know its author, and I know that I can fully trust his word. Next week, we will start the biology section with the topic, complexity and interdependence.